Ladies and gentlemen all over the world, you are tuned in to the one and the only A Difference in Thought. I'm your host, Charlie Ray, and here at A Difference in Thought engages and processes recent events, culture, philosophy, public policy, and faith through the ancient art of truth-telling. Join the conversation and gain an alternative perspective with A Difference in Thought. This podcast is an honor and homage to the work and mission of the great Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. right up above me. And the mantra and mission of the show is that basic arithmetic teaches us that there can be no difference without subtraction. Before first stating where you would like to see a difference, first consider where you're willing to take a subtraction. Welcome, everybody, back from your holiday. I hope that, or holidays, that was very meaningful to you all. I've been gone for a little bit, but no, this is probably how the show is going to flow as I get something that I think is interesting or something that you all should have to do, and then how I want to piece it together. That's how I'm going to come to you all, but it's exciting and great to be here. So today you are tuned into season 2, episode number 2 of A Difference in Thought, called No Room in the Inn, the Christ Child and the Habits of Empire. Now, some of y'all might be saying, hey brother, you sound like you a little bit late. Christmas is gone and past, all the days of Advent, all the Christmas carols have been sung. Maybe your dad is or has finally retired playing Johnny Mathis Christmas carols or whatever album that they play on repeat as dads duties are to do. Trees might be down, but here's the reason why I chose a little bit of a delay in actually talking about the Christ child, the Nativity, the Christmas scene, is because I think sometimes we view it a lot through the lens of commercialism and just kind of how we've been socially conditioned about this is the time where we do this, and so it's kind of just out of tradition and not really engaging our hearts and minds and actually considering what type of environment and context what we can draw parallels from. So one thing that's going to be really unique this season, and one thing that I'm trying to really push, is the theme that just because something is current doesn't mean something is new. And so when we're talking about, and we talked about this a little bit in the last episode, Distorted Nostalgia, where we were talking about the patterns of terror that have happened historically throughout America, and how though these events such as the tragic shooting at Tree of Life Synagogue are current, when you think about the history and patterns of violence that we talked about and lynching and things like that, they certainly are not new. And so one thing that a lot of times people talk about, especially when you're talking about the areas of justice, is that people term a theme that they call empire, right? And so some of y'all might be like, dun 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 dun, like The Empire Strikes Back for all my Star Wars. Man, a funny story about that, actually played the score to the Darth Vader theme when Trump was getting inaugurated or whatever. In one ear I had the inauguration, and in the other ear I had like that score for like the Darth Vader theme, and it was a great kind of precursor to prepare what the Trump administration has been, in my opinion. But anyways, we're talking about empire, and so empire or imperialism, right, is pretty much government dominance or high resources and violence and the ability to kind of keep people out of power for the profiting of a system that might be government, it might just be corporate, it might be concentrated wealth. And so it's examining this power building, what does it mean for the vulnerable and the people that we are really called to serve? And so it's an interesting book that I've been reading. It's a book called The First Christmas. And this is from a scholar who kind of finds value in examining the first Christmas through the lens of what he likes to call reading the Bible as a metaphor. Right now, saints, don't get mad. I'm not saying that it's no truth or any type of historical account of that, but he's saying when you understand the context of this, you can understand that the Christmas story is really about a vulnerable, oppressed people and how they respond and resist to the empire of their time. So the empire of their time would be the Roman Empire under Augustus Caesar. His real name was Octavian, later became Augustus Caesar, and specifically through King Herod. And we'll get into that a little bit later as we're talking about examining habits of empire. But he gives a very interesting look into things. So even when he talks about the Luke account and the names that are given to Jesus, such as being the Prince of Peace, or being the light of the world, or the anointed one, like the Christ, is really parallel to how the religion of Rome deified their leaders, right? So Caesar, and especially Caesar, since he was, I think it's called Pontifex Maximus, it's really that Caesar kind of held a role as king and priest, right? And so here we have this story is kind of being painted over the landscape of who the empire says is the progenitor of peace, who the empire says is the light, who the empire says is God, who the empire says is treasured, should be valued, and should be worshipped. And so Luke, and the resistance to that narrative, says that no, it's not. It's in God's kingdom, right, that Jesus speaks about. And Luke is very specific, and his narrative actually focuses a lot on a lot of people that are excluded from sometimes other ones, or other gospel accounts, or maybe he focuses on women more. He focuses, instead of Matthew talks about the Magi and the wise men, who we'll talk about later, he talks about shepherds, people who were a lower class, and saying that God's kingdom, right, is not about who the empire says we should worship and pay attention to, but it's about the vulnerable. It's about the people who are oppressed, the people who are under. And so Luke, by ascribing these names to Jesus, he is resisting the empire that would say Caesar is to be worshipped, and saying that Jesus is to be worshipped, that Jesus is the light, the heir of David, the offspring of David, meaning Jesus, but perhaps also meaning the people of Israel, right? And so it's just interesting to see. And I read the first Christmas almost as added meaning to what I believe is a true Christmas narrative. And so here you see, and we're talking about habits of empire, you see this really weird, so we don't understand with Jesus, and you understand this in Hebrews as well, that Jesus is king and priest, and Peter also talks about us being a royal priesthood, meaning if we suffer with Christ, we can reign with him as well. And so having this joint position of royal priesthood, this is something that Caesar Augustus enjoyed as Pontifex Maximus, which was a religious position under Rome. And I think that's actually kind of what the Pope was eventually called as well. They were typically separate offices, but Caesar joined them, and kind of saying, as the empire is the religion, the empire is what you believe in, right? And so Luke kind of counters that by calling Jesus the coming king, right? And so it's an interesting list. So even when this tension that you have between Rome and Israel, Jesus is birthed very much in the very thing of this. And so Luke's warning to us is to, in the midst of what the prosperous or those who have the most profit in society say to deem, he warns us not to miss the Christ child, not to say that there is, no room in the inn, right? Because and so one reason we talk this about the no room in the inn is that I think when outside of the Santas and Rudolphs and all these other things within Christmas, right? It's a very close call. It's a call for us to examine who is vulnerable in our society, who, when it comes time to their investment, to their protection, to preserving their life, do we run out of resources? Do we run out of care for? Do we run out of empathy for? Right? When you think about the tragic things that are happening at the border with the two children dying in custody in what seems to be preventable deaths. If more care was given to them, what does the Christmas narrative call us to respond to, and how their vulnerable lives could have been saved if people showed more care or more investment into their lives? And so when we're talking about no room in the inn, the Christ child inhabits the empire, we're going to be talking about who was vulnerable in Jesus's time, who was in power in Jesus' time, and how these gospel accounts call us to respond once we kind of understand more of the context of this, right? So if you go to Matthew chapter 2, and so for those who are unfamiliar with the show is dedicated to Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who was a reverend. He was a student, a doctor, an activist. He was many things. And so some episodes are kind of a Dr. King episode, a Reverend King episode. There's going to be a mix of all of that. So if I'm talking about Bible verses or I'm talking about policies, and we're going to get a little bit specific policy on how Richmond is in a no room in the inn moment, and how we are very much in a theological moment about who we're going to invest in with some upcoming policies and suggestions that are before the city council. And we'll talk about that later as well. And so Matthew 2, so it talks about the wise men that come to worship Jesus. Now the wise men come to Herod from the east. Some of them are referred to as the Magi, and they are wealthy, and they come bearing gifts. And they say that they come to worship the King of the Jews. Now Herod is not too happy about that, because Herod is called King of the Jews. Now, to give some context, now if you're just reading this like without any context and not any understanding, and not really understanding of a lot of the political context that goes behind this, the King of the Jews, like so for example, how did Herod even become King of the Jews, right? And what does it mean for Luke to be writing in a time under Roman oppression, where someone who was called king, he introduces people who he deems wise, who calls Jesus king, a vulnerable Christ child king, instead of who is lifted up as king during the current time, right? And so in order to understand that, we need to understand the specific title of King of the Jews, right? And that had special merit in the Roman Empire. If you also remember, when Jesus is killed, he is mocked by being called King of the Jews. We have to understand, during that time, this was under a different Caesar. So that is no longer, fast forward into the future in the Jesus narrative, that is no longer Augustus Caesar. That is Tiberius Caesar, and Caesar had different rules for who would govern Judea. So, for example, Herod's son Archelaus, who comes after him, he's only king for maybe a couple of years, 5 or 6 years. Then after that, because Judea has been such a place of resistance against the Roman Empire, they no longer trust Judea to have their own king. So they then have in a governor, right? And that's Pontius Pilate then becomes governor of Judea. But there's still a Herod in Galilee. That's why when Jesus dies, Pontius Pilate sends him to Herod, right? Antipas, right? Who was still over Galilee. But why is Pilate over Judea, right? What happens? Why does Judea no longer get king? So that's a very political resistance conversation that we will have. But first, let's talk about Herod, right? So Herod I think he's a good example of what Howard Thurman talks about in Jesus and the Disinherited, on how people who are suffering and people who are under oppression actually, the different ways they can respond. What does resistance look like? What does non-resistance look like? And he talks about non-resistance can actually look different ways. He's talking about non-resistance to whatever the empire says. And so he says in his book, Jesus and the Disinherited, and he kind of talks about the story of where he was a seminary student, and he had a Korean American student come in, and this is during the World Wars, and this is when Korea still was under oppression by Japan. And so he remembers this moment where this Korean American student is asked about what his experience is like in America, and he says, I know that y'all want me to come and talk about America, but the truth is, for the Korean people, the main thing on our minds is, how are we to be free from Japan, right? And so he kind of talks about how when people are under oppression, certain conversations that seem trivial or main to other people who may not be oppressed, that the oppression and what to do with the presence of an oppressor becomes a central conversation and preoccupation of the mind of people that are oppressed, and that there are two responses you can have. You can have a response of resistance or a response of non-resistance. And so I want to read through what Howard Thurman says about this. And so this is from Jesus and the Disinherited. He says, in the main, there were two alternatives faced by the Jewish minority of which Jesus was a part. And he's talking about now. So instead of talking about Japan and Korea, he's talking about Rome and Israel. So he said, in the main, there were two alternatives found by the Jewish minority of which Jesus was a part. Simply stated, these were to resist or not to resist. So here we have the two different options. He says, but each of these alternatives has within it secondary alternatives. So he's saying there are within the options to resist or not to resist, there are different ways. Like there are different ways to resist. There are also different ways to non-resist. I talk about this a little bit in my conversation with my friend Corey, when he was talking about, does he think that Dr. King's path of non-resistance would or as he deemed non-resistance, would have worked before a generation today. So he talks about each of these alternatives has within it secondary alternatives. Under the general plan of non-resistance, one may take the position of imitation, right? The aim of such an attitude is to assimilate into the culture and the social behavior pattern of the dominant group, right? And so we talked about this in the second baptism in season 1. If you haven't heard it, go ahead and go to SoundCloud, iTunes, Google Play Music, search A Difference in Thought, and go ahead and listen to that episode. And so he says the aim of such an attitude of imitation is to assimilate into the culture and the social behavior pattern of the dominant group. It is the profound capitulation to the powerful because it means the yielding of oneself to that which deep within one recognizes as being unworthy. So pretty much it's like, I don't really believe they're better than me, but because of how the societal power and resources are set up in order to survive, I just kind of succumb to this, right? It makes for a strategic loss of self-respect. So now he's talking about what is the purpose of only giving resources to people that submit. And this is what W.E.B. Du Bois talks about, right? When he talks about America's or whiteness's plan for those who choose to assimilate versus those who choose to resist. If you assimilate, then you can get some of the resources, right? If you don't, then you're kind of left out of it, because the strategy behind this is to have the oppressed person lose respect for themselves, lose belief in themselves, and to think that they can come out of this. So as he says, the aim is to reduce all outer or external signs of difference to zero. So pretty much say, to get these resources, I gotta behave in a way that makes the oppressor feel like my goals are his goals are my goals. I'm just here to get by into whatever. He says, so that there shall be no ostensible course for active violence or opposition. So he's saying, look, I'm not here to oppress you. I'm not here to resist or whatever. Like, I'm just trying to survive. So it's pretty much surrender, just all out surrender. Surrender, and then even posturing yourself in a way where you kind of disregard what your original society said that you are, right? So he says, this was also true of the Sadducees, talking about the biblical context, upper class. They did not represent the masses of the people. Any disturbance of the established order meant upsetting their position. So now he's talking about the motivations behind why people may choose to not resist, right? They loved Israel, but they seem to have loved security more. They made their public peace with Rome and went on about the business of living. They were astute enough to see their own position could be perpetuated if they stood firmly against all revolutionaries and radicals. So, let me tell you about this. So now he's transitioning to not just say non-resistance. So it's almost like there's a passive non-resistance where it's like, hey, whatever happens. But then he talks about an active non-resistance, which seems a little confusing, right? An active non-resistance is, man, now that I have assimilated and I've gotten some of these resources, I now am going to actively suppress anyone who is now trying to resist against the government that has given me these resources, or given me this spot, or given me this status quo, right? And so now he's saying there's another brand of non-resistance where people assimilate, get a little bit of power, and just pretty much do whatever they have to take to keep this little bit of power in an ultimately oppressive standpoint, right? And so their tragedy, so this is what he says, they were astute enough to see their own position could be perpetuated if they stood firmly against all revolutionaries and radicals. Their tragedy was in the fact that they idealized the position of the Roman in the world and suffered the moral fate of the Romans by becoming like them. So he says the problem with this is that you idealize the empire so much, you actually end up idealizing the people that actually actively oppress you, right? Or historically have oppressed you, because you then get into this personal versus systemic versus Rome has been good to me, but overall it's been bad to your people, right? And so there's this distancing of yourself from your group and your identity, because you want to be aligned with power, and you pretty much want to keep the status quo, right? But the tragedy of that, so he talks about the idealization of that, but then he also talks about a moral, spiritual fate that happens. And they suffered the moral fate of the Romans by becoming like them. And so now it talks about becoming like your oppressor. And so Dr. King often talked about, and it's kind of the biblical thing, is do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good, and saying that one of the things about hatred is that hatred can make you become the oppressor you first started off resisting. But here he's talking about participation and surrender can also make you like the empire that you once hated. So he's saying that success can alter you into the image of the empire, and hatred can as well. The opposition to those who work for social change does not come only from those who are the guarantors of the status quo. So he's saying you have to be smart when you're resisting things. When you're resisting an oppressive system, your enemy is not just going to be the system, right? But here's what he says. Again and again it has been demonstrated that the lines are held by those whose hold on security is sure only as long as the status quo remains intact. So he's saying, man, if you're resisting an oppressive structure, you got two enemies really, or two people who will resist you. You have people, one, the person who set the system in place, and then two, the people that benefit from the system that oppresses you, right? So the people that are reaping the benefits, and you have the person that's whatever, right? And so that's like the story of if you think of the story of Uncle Tom's Cabin, right, where you have there's the person there's a super cruel person, right, Simon Legree, who's breaking the slaves, and he's the enemy of the slave. But then there's the person, I think, are their names like Sambo and Quimbo, who like then get a little bit higher than the other slaves, and then they want to repress and beat the other slaves and different things like that as well. So I'm not lifting up Uncle Tom as some type of revolutionary or anything either. I'm just talking about the different power structures that are in play there, because that's the first example that came to my mind, right? And so he says all imperialism or all empire functions in this way. Its subject peoples are held under control by this device. And then he says one of the great examples of this is Herod, bringing it all back to Jesus' day. Now, why did I go through all that to talk about Herod? Because historically, we need to understand, right, how Herod got the name King of the Jews, and why Luke why Matthew in his rendition of this story is talking about wise men that come to King of the Jews and say that we come to worship the true King, but it ain't you. So that as a part of resistance, and so you even see worship and idealization as form of worship, right? And so meaning that if you admire those things that the empire does not admire, right? If you choose to admire those and uplift those who the empire says not, that within itself is a form of resistance, as Howard Thurman talks about. And so this is, I think, what Thurgood Marshall also would talk about when he talks about do not be sedated by success, meaning that do not, now that this oppressive system has chosen to not be as oppressive in this area, don't let that make you think that the oppressive system is now suddenly fully cooperating with you, right? Continue to resist as you gain things, but do not become this gatekeeper of security and the status quo, that you're not able to challenge this oppressive system as it rears its ugly head, because in the past it has somehow given you something nice. I talk about this in this discussion that I had with my friend Corey Goss. This is like an extra, just a side conversation that I'll have up on the channel as well. And we talk about how, you know, he always talks about people say people aren't being nice to Donald Trump because they won't talk about the nice things that he does. And so it's like, yeah, I can talk about, cool, I'm glad that you signed that prison reform bill, even though, you know, in 2021 you might need it yourself because you got some nonviolent offenses you might some of your people in your circle might be going to prison for. But anyways, yes, I can say I'm glad this is happening, but that doesn't mean that one good product that's coming out of a factory of oppression has to make me ignore the fact that an oppressive system is still going on with some of the rules repealing how to find segregation with the HUD rule, some of the things that Jeff Sessions rolled back in consent decrees and different things like this, and Betsy DeVos and all these other types of things that are happening. So it's just a kind of different way of saying stay focused and don't be sedated by success. So when we talk about Herod the Great, now Herod the Great, and we're going to give some history here, from 74 to 4 BC. So just so you don't get confused, before, some say before Christ, some say before the Common Era, history counted backwards. So after 74 came 73, 73 same 72, when we're talking about BC. Because it's going to be kind of confusing. I'm going to give you guys a timeline, right? So, things to understand about Herod. Herod was born in 74 BC. His father was an Idumean, that's also in the Bible, that's also referred to as Edom, which is the land where Esau, the brother of Jacob, the brother of Israel, came. So after that story of Jacob wrestling with God and Esau and Jacob hugging it out, bro. As it continued throughout history, their people did not always get along, and so actually, Israel in the earlier century of BC actually had about 90 years of independence. Well, so they started with securing their borders, but then they started to expand their borders. And one of the countries that they conquered, one was Samaria, and the other one was Edom, right? And so as they expanded into Edom, they also forced the Jewish religion onto, or their rendition of it onto Edom there through military force, kind of, right? And so this is so Herod actually came out of an oppressed people group as well, and so it came under John Hyrcanus the third, I believe, he strikes a deal with Pompey, who was then a ruler in Rome, and pretty much said that no Jewish kings would be allowed in Rome, but only religious power as high priest. So Rome comes in and helps them overcome some enemies of theirs, and says that here's the deal: you will have to kind of Rome. You will kind of be a colony of Rome, but you can still have religious power as a high priest, but it ain't gonna be any kings, right? And so Herod's father then is appointed as kind of like a governor of Galilee, right? And so understand this is now, and so then within Rome there's a civil war between Julius Caesar and Pompey, and Caesar's kind of gaining a lot of power, and so Pompey in the Roman world, right? So we think about what's going on in the Roman world and then how that affects the different tribes that they're under. Pompey is pretty much like, hey Caesar, you're getting real powerful. Why don't you come and talk without an army and come, and then you have to kind of give up the land that you kind of conquered on your conquest. Caesar is like, nah, I'm not about that life. He rolls up with 6,000 people on site. Pompey is like, I'm not trying to catch these hands. And so then there's like kind of this change of power that happens. But ultimately Julius Caesar is assassinated. And then a year later, then Herod's father is assassinated. It's not exactly clear why, but it probably has to do with the change of power that's happening in Rome. And then Herod succeeds him, and is affirmed by Rome to do so. So it's Rome now in the Civil War is kind of, they're still trying to figure out what happened after Caesar kind of won the first Civil War, and things are kind of, loose. And so Herod's is kind of there, and he's like, yo, kind of just slide in. My pops is dead. Kind of keep this power. And Rome's kind of like, all right, cool. You can do it. And so Herod is just kind of there chilling in this new power that he has. And so so then there's another civil war that breaks out, this time between Octavian and Mark Antony. So then he switches sides. He switches sides to pretty much like whoever wins. So Octavian confirms Herod is governor, because he's like, okay, you're rocking with me, then I'm going to go ahead and make you governor. Here's the thing. So now Herod is finally legitimized, at least until we see what happens at the end of this war. So Herod is sitting in this place of power. So again, we're talking about the status quo. You see that his priority here is that Herod isn't really a resistor, as Howard Thurman talks about. He is an active non-resistor, meaning that I'm going to do what it takes to retain this status quo that I have. Doesn't matter who I have to go through. So Herod then has an uprising on his hands by Antigonus, who was a Hasmonean prince, and he's a Jewish. Antigonus is a resistor, right? He's like, nah, I ain't down with Roman rule. I don't care what type of bells and whistles you give me. I want my people to be free. And if Herod's about that life, then Herod can catch these hands bent, right? So, but Antigonus is like, but he has Rome, who's kind of big. So, and Antigonus goes to Parthia to kind of get his own army and saying that, yo, bump these bells and whistles. I'm not impressed that Rome gave us a king light, right? Or whatever. I think that we should rule. So he comes, gets an army. Antigonus drives out Herod, right? Now, here's a weird thing. Now, Herod, you think that maybe he would say, like, man, well, they drove out Rome. I might not be a king, but at least I can live and my whole people can be free, right? So he comes through and drives out. So Antigonus drives out Herod. Herod then asks Rome, instead of saying, like, well, you know what? It's bad for me. I lost power, but it's good for my people. I have lost the status quo that I had under this, but at least my people are free, right? Nah. Herod goes to Rome and asks Rome to regain control and says, like, yo, can you help me kick out these people that kicked me out because I was working for y'all? Kind of sort of my people, but they kicked me out. Can you help me go take this back in the name of Rome? And so Rome comes through, helps him kick out Antigonus, so Mark Antony helps Herod retake Jerusalem, and it's at this point that the Roman Senate appoints Herod as the title King of the Jews, right? So at this point, he's appointed not by God, right, as King of the Jews. That normally flows through the line of David, as Matthew was kind of pointing out, and as Luke is both pointing out that Jesus and that Joseph and Mary are the line of David, as in that this is the way that God has chosen kings, through the vulnerable, in the same way that in the story of when David is first elected king, how his dad Jesse has all these powerful men that the world would say is a great leader, but God always chooses the vulnerable to lead. So here, this is how Herod becomes king of the Jews. And then throughout this point, Herod then begins assassinating people that kind of challenge his throne. He fights revolts against people that try to take his throne. When Octavian, who's on the other side of Mark Antony, in Rome, like when Mark Antony loses, then Herod switches sides to Octavian. So again, you see his whole thing is, I want the status quo, I want power, I'll do and I'll become anything I need to become to get this power, right? This dude even executes his wife, right? He rebuilds Samaria, but dedicates it to Augustus Caesar. He builds a palace for himself, puts his name on it. So you see that this guy is really about power, and even in times when he could have had freedom for the vulnerable, he resists it because he wants his status quo, and he also wants to actively attack those who are who's doing this. And so as Herod keeps going, he's building more things for Caesar, kind of as a token of, hey, I'm not resisting you, just let me keep my power. He builds the New Jerusalem temple. It actually extended a wing of the temple. Eventually in 7 BC, he has his 2 sons executed, right? Herod then proceeds against the Pharisees. He has another person executed for treason. So all in a summary, right? Herod. This is what Herod is known for, right? Herod, it's very hard to disconnect Herod from the Roman Empire, because his very title was given by the Roman Empire when he overthrew people who became an independent state or whatever. So when a lot of times people say Jesus never says, or the Bible never says anything against the Roman Empire, you have to understand the context of this. And so this is the type of person. This is the type of Herod is not the Roman Empire, though he's connected to it. He is an agent of it in order to just sustain his own power. And so when you see the story of Jesus entering this is the type of person. So when the Magi come to Herod, who's killed his wife, killed his 2 sons, betrayed people, switched sides, whatever, Herod's religion is winning. Right? Like he's not really a deep, dedicated person of faith to this faith that he's supposed to kind of represent or whatever. His religion is winning. And so when the Magi come in the Matthew account and say, we've come to worship King of the Jews, but it ain't you, now all of a sudden he sees the vulnerable as a threat, right? So 2 threats, right? One, it's a threat. It's a threat against his throne, but it's also a threat to his relationship with Rome, because anyone who's king of the Jews has to be approved by Rome. And so if there's a new king of the Jews that's not approved by Rome, then that's going to then mess up his status quo and his profit. And that's exactly what Howard Thurman was talking about. And so one of the things that seems to be the habit of power is not just, as we talked about earlier, about like religion becoming the empire, but also it makes security king for and status quo king, right? It makes winning becomes the religion, right? Who's ever winning, whoever can get this passed, whoever can get the Supreme Court seats that I want, whoever can get this law passed that I want, whoever can get this tax cut that I want, it becomes my religion to support them, because that secures the status quo that I want. Instead of being a person of morals and a person who resists and says, this is what my faith would inform me to do, or what my morals would inform me to do, or what would be best for my people, or this is what core to my identity. Now forget all that, brother. It's about winning. And so that's one of the habits of the empire that affected the Christ child, is because Jesus's life became much more harder and difficult by someone who sat in a position of claiming to be kind of like divinely appointed or whatever, right? But really his religion was winning. And what happens to a society, what happens to the vulnerable in society when the leaders only have a religion of winning, only have a religion of legacy? And so Herod here, he's building temples in his own name, or letting Caesar desecrate temples, even to the point of there were some people who were kind of more steadfast to the faith, and they knew that having a Roman eagle over the temple of God is something that's terrible. So these 2 people climb up and they take down the eagle off the temple. It's kind of like I think the sister's name was Bree Newsom, who in South Carolina. She climbs up and takes down the Confederate flag after the Dylann Roof kills those church members, because she's saying that this is something that shouldn't be represented, right? In light of what we claim to stand for, this isn't something that should be represented. So in that same spirit, these people climb up, take the thing. Herod has them arrested, and he says, I want you to hold them in prison until I die, and when I die, I want you to execute them on that same day, because I want the people to be sad when I'm dead. So again, he's so enclosed in himself that he is missing the vulnerable, and maybe even missing what God is trying to do in his time, because his religion is winning. And so it's been sad to see recently with even the president being willing to shut down the entire country because he wants to keep the vulnerable out, right? With this wall, right? And he may phrase it as something else, but because of the status quo of America, and this is something that John Fea talks about in his book. It's called "Believe Me: The Evangelical Road to Donald Trump," and he talks about how fear, power, and nostalgia among white evangelical Christians and wanting to be like Herod and wanting to retain the status quo where their faith and their way of thinking is embedded into laws and Supreme Court seats and all those other types of things, that they make the mistake. They share the same moral fate as Howard Thurman says of becoming like the oppressor that you're actually called to resist against. And so the reason why I'm talking about these different things and as we're flowing through history in the present and the Christ child excellent is because it's this theme that I'm talking about. Just because something is current doesn't mean something is new. But as you study what's going on currently and connect it to the past, we can make these links and we can become aware to some of the shortcomings of the past that traditionally hasn't happened. And so the story of the Magi versus the story of Herod, right? The Magi, they say, I am going to worship the real King of the Jews. I'm not going to worship whoever the empire has set up for me to worship. I am going to worship the Magi, even if it means a change in status quo, even if it means that the next time that I suddenly don't have free access to the king's palace, even if it means my own personal safety and security, because the Magi say that after revealing the dream that Herod is really trying to kill this child, they unlike Herod, decide that I'm willing to go against the empire. My faith and who I worship is willing to go against the empire to protect the vulnerable, to protect the Christ child. And so the Magi or wise men represent how Jesus can be prospered, right? And the vulnerable can be protected when those who claim to seek him discern and resist the empire's lies. And so this is what Howard Thurman talks about, the different levels of resistance. There's a resistance where you can go to violence, right? It's on the other side of the spectrum, but you can also talk about a moral resistance, right? Or as William Barber talks about, a moral revival, right? That resists and says I'm going to resist from a moral standpoint. I'm going to resist in who I invest in and who I support. And as I talk about here, we all have streams in this whirlpool of history. And the question is, are we contributing our stream into oppressive systems, or are we contributing our stream into a revolution of justice? And the Magi in this moment say, once they discern and are made aware of, right? So they have by divine revelation, they are able to discern that what the empire calls good is actually unjust. One, they do that work of discerning and not just taking the empire's words as truth, right? And you can see things like a documentary called The Propaganda Game that talks about how North Korea has their own way of brainwashing the people to think that whatever the empire says is true. So, or as our president says, fake news, right? So I'm able to discern what the empire calls fake, discern through what the empire calls good or great again, right? And I'm able, right, grounded in my faith, to say I'm going to contribute my streams into what God is actually doing. And I'm not just going to assume that whatever the empire does is God ordained because it means winning for me in my life, right? And so one of the other things within this narrative right here is talking about no room in the inn, right? And so it's interesting that another thing that Luke does talks about, and those in the Christmas narrative that talk about no room in the inn, is that they talk about that because they're saying Jesus and Mary are the line of Joseph. They're saying these vulnerable people are actually royalty, right? They may not have the power and the resources as all these other people that the empire is calling king and royal, but these vulnerable people are actually royal, and because of their royalty, right, we should make room for them, right? It says no room in the inn for who God deems royalty, sending who God deems royalty to dilapidated facilities and with under-resourced things, right? That is a habit of empire, right? So we talk about a habit of empire is one, making religion and politics the same, right? Then we have the habit of empire of winning the highest and reserving the status quo is a way that oppressed people can participate in it, but also a habit of empire that we want to learn from this is taking who God calls royalty and sending them to dilapidated facilities, right? And so now I'm not trying to stretch the text and say that these innkeepers were members of the Roman state, but I'm just saying let's meditate more so on the process and the experience of Jesus as he enters into this space that is kind of overseen by empire, and saying how many times in our society, right, do we take the vulnerable? Do we take children and do we put them into schools with dilapidated facilities and housing that is beneath their dignity, and how many times do we share this habit? And one thing that I wanted to talk about and bringing this into recent times is talking about the decision that Richmond has to make concerning this. Now, I heard that the mayor was kind of launching his own protest against, I guess, himself for March for More, or actually against the state, and saying that the state needs to give more funding. But there are some who say that there is some that the mayor can do here. And so I do want to thank the mayor on now proposing $800 million over, I believe it's 20 years, to Richmond Public Schools. And also thanks to the person who got the on the ballot initiative on when we were voting that says that we want the city wanted the mayor to make a plan on how he was going to endorse schools, or to say it can't be done by the December 31st deadline. So here, I actually hit the streets. I was there at the March for More campaign, and I also was able to talk to some of the counter protesters who were talking about this Coliseum project that some are saying, if not handled correctly, can kind of continue in the process of saying to those who ask for more things, for more funding for schools, for more opportunities, for more listening to the community that these projects historically impact, are typically told no room in the inn, or no room in the negotiations, or no room in the discussion, that this can be a continuation of this. And so, from what I understand, both of these are going to be discussions that have to come up in January. And so, and when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about investment as resistance. But this is going to be a segment of a difference in resistance, investment as resistance. This is Charlie Ray with A Difference in Thought. Check out A Difference in Resistance. Resistance was in order. And here we saw a marching band from Armstrong High School marching in step, demanding an equally funded education, just like the legacy and movement of children who had gone before them. If we're willing to look beyond the people in power and the narrative that often surrounds them, you'll find that today was something of the past. More on her later. The march started off from Martin Luther King Middle School, and it's made its way as many people from different camps were there to protest. Some of the cruelty that happened with Marcus David Peters. Some asking for better schools and more state funding. Some protesting the Coliseum that threatens the investment into schools. As we rounded the corner of the march, but also as a society, some questioned whether the Stoney administration was willing to build the will to construct not just coliseums, but also a more equitable future. To invest in schools, more so than coliseums, or at least do it in a more equitable manner. As the protest made it to the gates of power, the many reasons for protesting converged into one point, where the man of the hour and school administrators were put to the test. Now, this is a test that is not just unique to today. If you remember the girl through the trees here, we'll talk more about her now. This is Barbara Johns. Barbara Johns protested and marched and demanded equal funding for her school way before Brown versus Board of Education. But she didn't go alone. She had the friends that you see to the right, Oliver Hill and Spotwood Robinson. These legal minds joined the fight and won cases protesting a lack of equal funding during the times of segregated schools. They joined their streams with someone you might have heard of, a humble lawyer by the name of Thurgood Marshall. Barbara Johns' protest made it all the way to the Supreme Court in one of the cases of Brown versus Board of Education, and the rest is history. Or is it just history? We heard also this day from another young woman, a young student, demanding an equal education.
Today, I am here. Sorry.
Take your time. You got it.
Thank you. I am a senior at Armstrong High School and ambassador of the National Honor Society, and I hold the title of Miss Armstrong 2018 United. I am here today not only to represent myself or my school, but I'm here to also represent all of my peers of RPS. Because of the lack of funding in our schools, my peers and I have a difficult time living up to the goals that we set aside to be successful. All because of the minimum equipment and lack of assistance towards our schools. All my life I've been hearing, you are the future. Stand up for what you believe in. Give it your best. However, in order for me to hold up my end of the bargain, you have to hold up yours. Start funding in more up-to-date technology and higher qualities of RPS schools so that my fellow peers following behind me can have a better school experience. All students deserve to have an eventful and rewarding experience. Our schools are supposed to represent hope. So I today, representing all of my RPS peers, we all demand that Virginia start funding in our schools so that every student, not just one, every student can reach their full potential.
Right across the street from these riveting speeches making an appeal to the state of Virginia to provide equal funding to the less fortunate, right across the street is the United States of Appeals. Now, in keeping track with the Nativity narrative that talked about three kings that presented treasures, the United States Courts of Appeals is actually surrounded by three kings of a different currency, shall we say. Three banks: Bank of America, Wells Fargo, and SunTrust. The teacher that speaks next will be talking about his feel on how the influence of money is actually getting in the way of the vulnerable. Here's the Teacher of the Year of Virginia.
Good afternoon. My name is Rodney Robinson, and I'm the 2019 Virginia Teacher of the Year, and I'm here to say our kids deserve better. On November 13th, the state of Virginia announced that Amazon and the richest man in the world, Jeff Bezos, would be moving their headquarters to Virginia, an announcement applauded by politicians across the state. But they also promised them $1 billion to help them get here. 1 week later, students at an RBS high school could not have gym class because of a giant rat in the middle of the gym floor. No student should be forced to learn in these conditions, and I'm here to say our kids deserve better. That $1 billion could pay for more teachers, counselors, wraparound services, and 21st century school buildings that are not infested with roaches, rats, and mold. Our kids deserve better. The state of Virginia has almost another $1 billion in surplus money that they want to use to expand highways in Northern Virginia. We need to use that money to expand the minds of children by providing more art, music program, and trauma-based care. Our kids deserve better. The state wants to build high-speed rail, where children in the rural areas of Virginia don't even have high-speed internet to compete with other students around the country. Our children deserve better. Virginia is the #1 state referring students to law enforcement because the state of Virginia spends 40% less on at-risk students than other states in the country. Law enforcement is being used to solve problems when kids need counselors, psychologists, and social workers to help them. Our kids deserve better. I see the results of this every day because I teach in the juvenile detention facility. I have seen firsthand the results of underfunded and understaffed schools. I have a student who committed a gun crime while after experiencing the trauma of watching a close friend die in his arms. When I asked him why he responded with gun violence to a comment someone made at school, he told me I was angry and I needed somebody to talk to. That is not the student's fault that he's in jail. That is the fault of the state for not providing enough sport and mental health services so that kid could receive at a fully funded school. Our kids deserve better. And right now, I want every politician to hear me, because I'm issuing a warning that if we do not get better and more funding for our schools, we will remember this come Election Day, November 5th, 2019. We will boot you out of office because our kids deserve better.
Up next, we hear from the man himself, the mayor. Now, what's important to know is that on the ballot last year was a decision that said the mayor had to propose a city-funded way, not a state, but a city-funded way to fund Richmond public schools by December 31st, or to say that it can't be done. So here's the speech from LeVar Stoney from the March for More movement, and it's important to note that 2 weeks after this was recorded, LeVar Stoney, the mayor, devoted to investing $800 million of Richmond money to RPS over 20 years. Here it is.
Are you cold? Are you here? Yes! Did you enjoy the march? Yes! Now is the time. We have waited a very, very long time for the Commonwealth to step up and do their part. I want to begin by thanking all the elected officials who joined us today. Superintendent Dr. Cash joined us well from Henrico County. Our friends from Lynchburg are with us today. Mr. Cameron, thank you so much. The number of teachers and the delegates and parents and students who have joined us today, this would not be possible without you. Each and every day, there is a young man or a young woman who wakes up with a dream. And it is our job, as elected officials, as teachers, all working together to give them the legs to stand on to achieve that dream. Unfortunately, the Commonwealth of Virginia has cut the legs out underneath many of our children. For the last 10 years, as I said earlier, we have seen one of the most robust recoveries in a generation in terms of the economy. Yet we've seen a disinvestment from the Commonwealth of Virginia. As was stated earlier, a 9% drop in education funding, while 5% increase in enrollment across this state. Kids who live in Southwest Virginia, who live in the Valley, who live in Northern Virginia, who live on the Eastern Shore, and who live in urban areas like Richmond have been forgotten. Today, we stand up and say, you will hear us, and you will hear us today, you will hear us tomorrow, you will hear us in January. Let me tell you this. I would not be standing before you today if it wasn't for public education. I had a father who did not graduate from high school. I had a grandmother who didn't graduate from high school, went into 8th grade. They poured their dreams, their hopes, and their livelihood into me. And as devout taxpayers as well, they believe in getting me the best education possible. For many people who look like me, black people, folks who've been marginalized in the past and continue to be marginalized today, education is our pathway to the middle class and above. We are not doing our job if we are closing those pathways today. My number one fear when I go to bed at night is that a person like me, who grew up with parents who didn't have a high school education, will be able to achieve their dreams in this society. It should be heartbreaking, not just for folks who are here today, but the folks who occupy the seats in the General Assembly. And we do have allies. Delegate Van Valkenburg's here with us today. Delegate Bourne is here with us today. Delegate McQuinn's with us today. The allies are there. But guess what? They cannot do it without your support. You have to power this movement. If you want more money for public education, I need to see you each and every day down here in the General Assembly. On the cold January mornings when subcommittees are occurring. I need to see you on January 28th. Marching with teachers from across the Commonwealth of Virginia. I want to see you wearing your red. This is about the future. Do we stand on the sidelines idly while the future passes many of our children behind? Or do we stand lockstep together, focused on the General Assembly for more money for education? I think you all know what the answer is. The answer is yes. So if you are tired, like I'm tired, if you're tired of the shortchanging, the disrespect to the teachers, those who inspire our children each and every day, I need you here. Not just today, but in January and in February. If you are tired to the disrespect to the bus drivers and the custodians like my father, who come to work every day, not just to make a livable wage, but to inspire the next generation, I need you with us. If you are tired of buildings falling down, crumbling right before our eyes, I need you with us today and tomorrow. This is not just about people coming together to make some statements. This is about demanding more for better schools and for stronger children. Can we do that? Can we make that happen? Can we do it today? Can we do it tomorrow? Can we do it in January? Can we do it in February? Will they hear us? I can't hear you. I can't hear you. Let's get it done. Thank you.
After the mayor's speech, I stuck around, as journalists do, to see how other people were feeling about the day. It's important to know that the speech was made while General Assembly was not in session and the governor wasn't there. There was a lot of skepticism and questions asked. And for those who wondered what the mayor meant when he said "see you in January," I got a chance to catch up with the organizers of the Red for Ed March happening on January 28th. Here it
is a result of Mayor Stoney wanting to put pressure on the state, right? And that process has been going on as long as I've been alive, right? That the city says we don't have enough money for schools, the state's got to give us more. State says, well, that money's got to come from somewhere else, and that money's got to come from other schools that we've got to defund, right? So it's been back and forth. Mayor Stoney didn't want it just to get behind the Red for Ed March. We have to have something to put pressure just on the state, right? So meanwhile, we've got the Coliseum project. No one wants to talk about gentrification. No one wants to talk about the rent going up all over the place. No one wants to talk about the actual cost of the people that live in those communities, right? That we want to talk about like, oh, this money's going to come back to us, right? It always trickles down, right, is the idea. I'm still waiting for it to trickle down. I ain't seen it trickle down. And so we're hoping to make it clear we have a lot of signs about the Dominion tax cuts that are part of this project too that no one wants to talk about either. We got McEachin got up there and spoke. His number 2 donors are Dominion Energy and Northrop Grumman, right? We think he gives a crap about that? No. Like these projects, they also have to have a cut for their backers too. So that needs to be in the conversation if we want to talk about actually getting money. We know where the money is, they just don't want to give it to us.
Dominion and Amazon don't need our investment money. Our schools need the investment money.
So I know it's like a marching order. Who's going to plan it? I know that a lot of times that we've gotten this far throughout the process without getting like a community benefits payment or things like that as well. So like, what are your thoughts on that? On how projects like the Diamond or the Redskins facility and all these things that kind of set up almost like corporate colonies here that the community is almost brought in at the tail end and they're thrown like jobs, but they don't want to support living wage.
And what jobs are they thrown, right? It's like the Amazon HQ, right? That's going to bring such and such jobs to the state. The high-paying jobs, they're busing people in from all over the country. That's not bringing jobs to Nova. The Coliseum, the jobs that it's going to bring are low-paying, part-time jobs, right? Like stuff where we're still fighting for it. Meanwhile, the rent keeps going up. We're not putting the community first anywhere, right? Like that's the problem from the jump.
Thank you. So how can people get involved that are just going to rally around your cause and what things that we can do?
Red for Ed March.
Red for Ed March.
January 28th.
All right, so tell us more about the Red for Ed March. How to come along and
So this is built on the larger movement from organizations like we saw, especially in West Virginia, but we've seen teacher strikes all over the country kind of building off of this momentum.
In states that are traditionally hostile to labor, no less.
Yes. States without many labor rights, God knows Virginia is not friendly to labor in the slightest. So it's an obstacle that's got to be overcome. So building into that movement is massively important.
Right. No, that's very important. Thank you all for that. Thank you all for the work that y'all are doing.
January 28th, Red for Ed.
Okay, thanks.
Absolutely.
As we reflect on the habits of empire in the times of Jesus and Herod, who often put power and profit over people, we stand in a theological moment. When met by the cries of the vulnerable, to invest in a future that equips them, will we say no room in the inn? Or will we resist the historic habit of empire and listen to the children like Barbara Johns? Have we learned from that history, or are we still trapped in habits of empire? This has been a difference in resistance, investment as resistance. And so there you have it, investment as resistance. And so continuing this theme that we're talking about just because something is current doesn't mean that it's new, right? And so I thought it was very powerful to kind of end that last segment where it talks about we're in a space again, just as Barbara Johns, demanding more, talking about a lack of equality. And while she was met with massive resistance, let's make sure that we're not met with massive investment in things that would cripple or make it harder to invest in the places that we need to be into. And this cry for investment in the vulnerable that's sometimes met with is met with denial or sometimes even met with violence, right? We're talking about the history of what has happened when people like the Magi in the historical account have used their own resources and called to take our resources from just the empire and bringing them to the vulnerable. That is what the Magi did. That's what the Magi did in the Nativity story. But this is something that wasn't just this is something that even happened during times within the Roman Empire. And so when we talk about it, and this is way before Jesus. Now remember, Jesus was born, some say around 6 BC, 4 BC, the latest. And so there were these people called the Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius, not the obviously not the Caesar's Tiberius, since he was right around the midlife of Jesus is when he comes in after Augustus. But Tiberius and Gaius, and around 132 BC, and this the reason I have this conversation is because the empire isn't just about the Roman Empire, but it also talks about people who have profit and access. And so one of the main fights and disenfranchisement that was happening of poor people during the times of Tiberius and Gaius is that a lot of the aristocratic people and the rich people would kind of buy up the land, and then they would kind of push the peasants off of the land, and sometimes even veterans and soldiers that were not able to kind of get land, and so it was very much this land grab where people who were rich just kind of could grab it up and keep out who they wanted, and that was another form of empire. And so we talk about the political form of empire. It's also an economic form of empire that can happen, and that's what some of the people were kind of protesting at the March for More and saying that let's not forget about economic empire that can happen while we're just talking about political empire that can happen, and that both of those conversations need to be happening. And so in 132 BC, Tiberius and Gaius, they were tribunes, and so they attempted to pass land reform legislation that would redistribute the major aristocratic landholding among the urban poor and veterans, in addition to other reform measures to kind of make a more equitable process, because people were actually these poor people and these veterans were just surviving off of handouts because they just was no way for them to have land and to kind of really just contribute into a land that kind of made for that. And so they actually were making had some achievements and some early success with this, but guess what happened? Both were assassinated by enemies of the reform. And so when we talk about empire, the first half we kind of talked about political empire. Secondly, we have to talk about economic empire, right? Who gets invested in versus who gets no room in the end, and is in this dilapidated type of thing there was, and to understand just how much Jesus was put at risk by that, because in his book for First Christmas, it talks about that the mortality rate of infants around the time of Jesus' death, and in the town that he was from, and for the people that lived under such oppression, that it was as high as 80%. So just coming into that oppressive environment, 80% chance, right, of losing that child, and then to be told there's no room to put in even more dilapidated places, even increase that even more. So even the more miraculous, not just the conception, but actually that he was born into those type of circumstances, would have been a miracle itself in that day. And so when we talk about the economic things, we talk about, again, just because it's current doesn't mean that it's new. And we see that when people make this request for moving against the economic empire, right? And one of my heroes here that I have here, Brother Whitney Young, he called for his civil rights thing was actually about economic ways of empowering people so that people could thrive and flourish, right, within what this, I guess, economic empire is. So it's calling for investment, right? Investment as resistance. That's really the life of Whitney Young. And it's my belief that I think this also helped, and also this came with Dr. King living in slums and ghettos, and actually entering that space and understanding that not only was there a need for civil rights, but also investment and equity. You see here in his book To Be Equal, Whitney Young, after seeing how the U.S. rebuilt Europe after the World Wars, and they had something called a Marshall Plan that would actually help them rebuild their infrastructure and things that were bombed and things like that, so that they could come back and be able to have that investment and be able to thrive. Whitney Young says, well, dag on it, man, we need a domestic Marshall Plan, right? We need people that are willing to invest in us here and to rebuild just the ravages that people are living under economically because of slavery and racism and Jim Crow and all these other types of things. So in this book, To Be Equal, it actually talks about what he thought would be the type of investment that would be needed to change the economic oppression of people. As he progresses through time, he's actually though he wasn't directly on the commission, he was one of the advising voices for the Kerner Commission, which we talked about in season 1, I believe, the episode that talks about Who's Past Matters, that talks about how Lyndon B. Johnson put together the Kerner Commission, and after the Detroit riots, and wanted to say what was the cause of this, and the people on the commission said it's a lack of investment. Pretty much historically, we have told this side of town that there's no room in the inn, and we've put them into dilapidated circumstances, and they have chosen, as Howard Thurman says, the alternative of resistance through the use of violence. And that is pretty much because of not just the political decisions we made, but the economic empire of racism has put them in a place where they're feeling that they're at wit's end, right? And this happened in 60, and so these results come out, and Lyndon B. Johnson pretty much says, look, man, we've got this war that's going on, and some of these civil rights people are hawking out against my war, and I don't really have, I didn't know it was going to be all that. And it just kind of dies, kind of goes flat. And this is also the year within Dr. King, when we talk about the 67-68 transition, that talks about not just civil rights, but also economic investment, or as John Hope Bryant says, from civil rights to silver rights, right? And the economic investment, and even the Freedmen's Bank that Frederick Douglass tried to do back in the day during Reconstruction and different things like that. How he says, Dr. King says, we're going to go to Washington and we're going to get our check. He says this in, I believe, February or March in 1968. And then by April, he is assassinated. So here, as we see this, as we talk about historically with Tiberius and Gaius making this and then being assassinated, talk about Dr. King talking about this and being assassinated. Whitney Young writes another book called Beyond Racism and talks about what's required to go beyond racism and the type of investments that are needed and what it would mean to build an open society and again the economic investment. And he starts off the book talking about Lyndon B. Johnson's failure to do something substantial about the Kerner Commission. Because that was, again, hey, I got a war, I got whatever, no room in the inn, right? When we talk about reflections, and so the Poverty and Race Research Action Council, they actually, in volume 27, they actually did a 50-year follow-up with the Kerner Commission, because 2018 was the 50-year follow-up of this again, this no room in the inn, no way of investment. We don't have the money within our economic empire to do these things, because it's typically when you talk about living wage, when you talk about which Dr. King kind of talked about in his last book, Where to Go From Here, Chaos to Community. We talk about all these types of things for the people that are oppressed, and healthcare, and all these other types of things. Oh, we don't have money for that. We don't have money for that. But when it comes to wars and all these other types of things, or building a wall, right? Suddenly, all this money is available. But when it's time for investing in the vulnerable, investing in the poor, then we get no room in the inn. We see that habit of empire coming up again. And so, Sherilyn Ifill, I found the things that she says, that how racism is directly rooted to the economic things. Say even to this day, she says, with this comes my fear that we've come to accept this physical landscape as inevitable, instead of recognizing that the removal of racism and segregation's manifestations in our cities, towns, and suburbs was among the massive projects called for the civil rights efforts of the 1950s and 1960s. And then she says, uprooting racism from our physical landscapes is the project that should have been undertaken with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1968. So she's talking about racism that happens in land use, and again, how the economic empire plays out still to this present day. She says, what's the project called for in many ways in the recommendations of the Kerner Commission report. And I think we know now that we have failed in this project. Thus, the policies and decisions that we make are allowed today. Any decision that affects housing, zoning, development, or infrastructure, unless they are explicitly and deliberately focused in some measure on ameliorating, responding to, or providing reparation for pre-existing discrimination in the physical landscape, those policies and decisions are either perpetuating pre-existing manifestations of discrimination or contributing to new dimensions of a discriminatory landscape. And she talks about we miss opportunities to do the kind of relentless upending and interruption of segregation and racism in our physical landscape that is required if we are get to a place not only of integration, right, but of equity, reparation, and fairness. And so here she's talking about, and we're talking about reparations and making repairs for things, but that's all has to do with how the economic empire works in America and in the world. And so this no room in the inn response, this is something that throughout society we have seen. It's a pattern that continues. It's a pattern that continues not only on the global and national scale, but as we're kind of shrinking down and trying to be more focused in what we're asking for. Even when we talk about the city of Richmond, and when we talk about the fact that things like community benefit agreements aren't a fundamental part of what we do in development in our city, and planning in light of the history of racism in our city and being the capital of the Confederacy, and then the lab that has exported to the world things such as white supremacy and a lot of these other things that have economic consequences. The fact that we do not up front talk about that is basically a no room in the inn situation. And so she talks about ways that we can disrupt the economic empire, right? When we talk about land use and things like this, especially when we're talking about the different projects that are trying to come to Richmond, and the history of Navy Hill being a historically black neighborhood, where historically it was a black neighborhood, and when I-95 came through, they drove it through and cleared out all of these housing, the economic realities of what that still means, and even what that means in Jackson Ward and things like that as well, where the only black remnant of that neighborhood is a church, right? That didn't get bulldozed, right? So what happens when you regard the house of God but not the image of God, right? As a society, what are the economic implications of that? So she says, for example, if cities, major urban centers or suburban cities had ordinances that required every development project over a certain amount of money to include a detailed plan of how that development would foster or promote racial and social economic integration, then developers would have to regularize this as part of their thinking and planning and not view it as a bar to development, right? So again, man, I'm here to talk about all that economic or reparation, all the that is a habit of empire, right? And so she says we can do this today. No tax breaks or support should be given to major development projects in your community. Imagine that in Richmond. No tax breaks or support should be given to major development projects in your community unless those developers have as a part of their plan, right? Not no room in the inn or we can't do that, but no, this is going to be a part of their plan. Identified how they will address, confront, and play a part in dismantling racial and social economic segregation in your town, city, or county. It is key to understand that nearly every decision that affects development or infrastructure has an implication for segregation. Imagine that in this conversation with what's going to happen with Dominion and Navy Hill and what's going to happen with all the hotels and all the things that they're bringing in. Imagine if as a city we said no tax breaks or support should be given to major development projects in our community unless those developers have as a part of their plan identified how they will address, confront, and play a part in dismantling racial and social economic segregation in our town, city, and county. Just imagine, right? Freeing up your divine imagination. I think that is what Howard Thurman is talking about in the ways of moral resistance and freeing up the divine imagination to say that no, I'm not just trying to bargain to keep a status quo, but that the status quo can change, right? That not only can we make room in the inn, but we can construct an inn and construct a system, construct an economic period of ways of investment, so that the next 100 years that some of the most vulnerable, who were previously the most vulnerable in our society in 100 years, can be the ones equipped by this economic system to be making the next deal for what this should look like. And so when we're reflecting on the Christmas narrative, right, now outside of the gift giving and gift cards and run to Macy's and all these other types of things, as we talk about what this actually calls us to and the habits of empire, right? Again, internal, no difference. No, there is no difference without subtraction. What habits of empire do we need to subtract from our lives? Are we so to a point that politics has become our religion, or whatever tribe we're in, that as long as it's doing it, that must be what is approved. Has our religion solely just become winning and more profit and more and more and more and more? Are we operating in a space that says no room in the inn when it comes to investing and protecting and advancing the most vulnerable in our society? Those are the questions that I want us to examine, and specifically in our city. Now it's been proposed for $800 million over 20 years, and I know we're also talking about spending $1 billion combined with the private and the public funds, or $1.2 billion now, I think, on a Coliseum and on more ways of profit. And sure, there are things built in to talk about how that could do, but that's still an if, and that's still an investment that we're in. How can we make sure that, as Sharon Leifel says, built into the plan, not a oh, I'm glad that happened, we'll act like that's the plan, or we don't have room for that. How can being built into the plan, being built into a society, built into the habits of our lives, is the positioning of the wise men in the Matthew account that forsakes the dictates of empire and uses their resources, their strategy to protect and to equip the vulnerable for what they're called to do. Because the crazy thing about what the Magi gave is that they gave things that were traditionally used in burial. And so the Christ child was destined to die, but he was equipped by these people who forsook the empire's dictates to equip this child for what they're destined to do in the future. And so the question is, as a society, with our resources, do we just do the dictates of, are we Herods, or we're just about our legacy moves and how we can make the best out of what we have? And do we resist those who are trying to actually build a better society? Or are we like the Magi who say, I'm not going to participate, I'm not going to contribute my stream to a stream of oppression. I'm going to contribute my stream into a revolution of justice, where my resources are used, my influence is used to equip the vulnerable to do what God has destined them to do. And so I know some of you are saying, well, man, where was the segment on Do Better Baby? But I want to say, as a society, we need to do better. As a society, it shouldn't be that every time that when Whitney Young talks about the Domestic Marshall Plan, that it's denied. When the Kerner Commission talks about it, it's denied. When Dr. King talks about it, he's assassinated. With Resurrection City and the Poor People's Campaign, that it's almost ignored. And when we're building buildings for as legacy moves and saying, oh, this boulevard or this training center or this Dominion thing, instead of launching it as something to put on my resume, is it something that is putting on the community that is affected by it? And if that is not our mode of operation, if that is not built into the plan, then we all need to do better. This, I believe, is the meditation that we should have around the Nativity Story. This has been Season 2, Episode number 2, No Room in the Inn, The Christ Child and the Habits of Empire. I'm your host, Charlie Ray. If you haven't subscribed already, go ahead and subscribe. And also, I'm also going to throw up and link to some great work by some sisters named RVA Dirt. They hosted a community discussion that I have the honor of filming and helping out with. It kind of really breaks down the history of this Navy Hill moment that we're in. It kind of talks about what the plans are, kind of what the concerns from the community are. If you want to talk about people that are very much in touch with some of the vulnerable in society, I want you all to watch it and become more informed about it and see what habits of empire you see in it, and that we can all pray and work together for in America and for Richmond, where if the Christ child were to come today, he would be equipped to do what he's destined to do. My name's Charlie Ray. I love you. That's why I'm here. Peace.